in the annals of the town of Mendon, Dr. Metcalf had written, the old meeting house was getting dilapidated and entirely out of fashion, not having a tower, a spire, and a bell. So a group of movers and shakers in town, wealthy gentlemen, decided that we needed a new meeting house, or Mendon needed a new meeting house. They had several offers, one of which was from Jonathan Russell, who was going to donate $800 and some odd toward and donate land, but they chose Seth Hastings' offer of an acre and some rods and $650, and so the church is here. They hired the well-known architect Elias Carter, who was known for his white steepled New England churches, the most famous of which I guess is in Templeton, Massachusetts. And the construction of the building was completed within a year. People donated money. I think they raised $6,000 and some odd dollars toward that effort. Seems paltry in this day and age, but anyway. And then they were selling the pews. The pews range from $15 to $300 a piece, depending on how many. I think some people had more than one pew. The church was dedicated, and I'll refer to my notes. I know. While they were building it, no alcoholic beverages were allowed on the property or a public way near the property. And I think that was because when the fourth meeting house was being built, in a different location from the original three, people were angry, and some of the men would come in at night with axes and chop down what was being constructed. So they bribed them with a barrel of rum so that they would leave it alone until the meeting house would be built. After it was completed, after the church, there was a 5-tiered steeple that rose to 130 feet. The bell was made by a man named Peter Holbrook, who was an apprentice of Paul Revere. And the Reverend Doggett, who had been the minister at the fourth meeting house, came here to preach. He was a very well-educated man, but I get the idea that he was a little stiff, and there was a lot of contentiousness between the old school faith and the more liberal faith that was coming up, although the church had been Unitarian since 1802. The Reverend Carlton Staples from Providence, Rhode Island, had talked on one of the anniversaries of the church being built and said that it probably was not the most, Mr. Doggett probably was not the most popular minister. They called him a painful preacher. Although he was mentored to a lot of students at Brown University, he was dismissed by his own request in 1831 and went to Haverhill. Well, he served until he was 87 years old when he died, the oldest Unitarian minister. Mendon was seeking a minister to replace Mr. Doggett, and by that time only 8 members of the congregation remained. They had moved to the Congregational Church that was built in 1831, which was more conservative than the Unitarian Church. It says here, the committee appointed at your last meeting to procure some suitable person to supply the pulpit with preaching for the current year would ask leave to report that they have attended to the duty assigned them, and at the unanimous request of the parish at their last meeting waited on the Reverend Aidan Blue and made arrangements for him to supply our pulpit for the present year at $350 payable semi-annually, all of which is respectfully submitted. Amariah Taft and E.W. Hayward, Committee for Procuring Minister. Now, most of these ministers had a 1-year appointment initially, and then if they were approved they were hired full-time. Mr. Ballou was born in Cumberland, Rhode Island. His parents belonged to an organization, a religious group called the Christian Connection. And Mr. Ballou apparently decided to become a minister because he had a vision of his dead brother who told him that he should become a preacher. So that was his calling. He really had no significant education. He didn't go to Harvard. He didn't go to Brown like many of the others had. But he was hired by the Mendon Church. There was a lot of contention because he was a strong advocate of the temperance union and the abolition. And a lot of people didn't agree with that. So he, because of the contentiousness, he resigned at one point, but changed his mind and decided that he would return, asked permission, and apparently they did rehire him, and he stayed for 10 years in Mendon. Then moved to the Hopedale community, and set up, I should say, he set up the Hopedale community, which was a utopian community, very popular at that time. He was replaced by a minister called Linus Shaw, who had some problems with the church. They hired him for a year, and he finally wrote a letter asking them to make a decision at least 2 months before his term was up so that he could make arrangements for his family. They did hire him, but he also wrote a letter saying that the salary was $100 less than he had ever received. It was $400 a year. And he could afford to feed his family, but he couldn't afford anything extra like to expand his library or buy publications. Anyway, in 1944 he wrote, "I received early last week a request from a society to come and supply their pulpit. Although by our last contract you had the kindness to bind yourselves and leave me free, I yet feel unwilling to give an affirmative reply to the request I have received until I have presented the case to you and solicited a free expression of your feeling and opinion as regards to my duty in the matter. I do not wish to leave you and go to another place from considerations merely personal or selfish. If I leave, I wish to do it with your entire company, and because all things considered, you think of my duty and therefore blessed. If you have a reply or expression, may I have it soon, as I wish to answer the letter as early as possible this week. Your friend and servant, Linus Shaw." He stayed. They did not let him go. From that time on, really, and I'll try to be briefer, the ministers, after Mr. Shaw left in 1948, the ministers only stayed for anywhere from 1 to 3 years. That was it. Until 1922, actually, when Mr. Winterstein became the minister. Mr. Winterstein actually stayed for 15 years. And actually, I'm wrong. He stayed for 23 years. And then, and in the meantime, we were sharing ministers with Hopedale, Milford, and Uxbridge. In 1955, they hired Reverend Kafka, and we were sort of yoked with Uxbridge. And from then on, after Mr. Kafka left in the late 60s, he was there for about 10 years, and he left under unpleasant circumstances, shall we say. We got an interim minister named Peter Denny. Now, at the time, by that time, he was preaching from 9:30 to 10:30 in Mendon, and then go to Uxbridge and preach from 11 to 12. When we hired the interim, Mr. Denny, he stopped that. And what happened was we'd preach so many months in Mendon and so many months in Uxbridge. He actually increased the membership. He was a very charismatic preacher, but was only allowed to stay for 2 years because after John left, 10 years, after 10 years, went to Bedford, we had a series of ministers. We had some supply ministers, we had some settled ministers, but they really didn't last too long. We finally hired, or the church I should say, finally hired Ralph Clark, who has been here for 15 years and just retired. The congregation has just hired a new minister. And let's hope things pick up. I think that there are several factors involved in the fact that there aren't a lot of people attending church, one of which is that people aren't going to church anymore as much. So anyway, that's about the history. That's the tip of the iceberg of the Unitarian Church, and that's it. Thank you.